I recently discovered a portal of nostalgia to some very cool gaming artifacts. Thanks to the website retromags.com and also the Internet Archive, you can read in digital format a huge number of gaming magazines from the past. These are treasures as far as I'm concerned, because they come from a time when the internet was virtually non-existent. Your access to any gaming news either came from the kid at school who claimed that his uncle worked for Nintendo, or one of these magazines. So I invite you to join me as I look at some of the highlights from issue number 1 of my personal favorite gaming magazine growing up, Electronic Gaming Monthly. Let's take a look. Check out this cover artwork. It is hideous, and I love it. Mega Man 2 is featured on the cover, which in my opinion is still one of the best NES games. It's in my top 5. It was the first Mega Man game I played, and the Dr. Wily stage is fantastic. What a game to have on the cover of your first issue. Great choice. One thing I also love about these old magazines are the advertisements. I don't know if I'm showing my age here, but I just find them to be more relatable rather than the over photoshopped advertisements of today. I mean, here you have John Elway playing Nintendo, and I'm looking at this goofy kid next to him thinking, I could be that kid playing Nintendo with John Elway. And one other thing, you see how John Elway is holding the NES controller? I think I've seen some speedrunners adopt that particular way of holding the controller as well. So maybe John Elway here was way ahead of his time. So if you notice I'm skipping pages in the magazine, it's because I'm not trying to cover everything. I don't want this video to go on forever, so I'm mainly just focusing on the things that I found most interesting. Here's another aspect of these old magazines that I really find fascinating. Most of them would have a section that identified the top games of that particular month, and they're a very good indicator of what was popular at the time. And so, not surprising here, the late 1980s, I believe we're in May 1989 with this issue, this chart is just dominated by the NES. And I never had a Sega Master System, so I can't speak to those games on here, but I know the Nintendo games I was either wanting to play or had rented up to this point, and the kids at school who were gamers were talking about them too. So it's a pretty decent list. And there are some stinkers on here too. For example, at number 9, Racket Attack, which was just a very poor playing tennis game that really doesn't hold up at all today, and really wasn't that great back then either. So I don't know how it made the list. And Dr. Chaos, that wasn't a bad game, but I am puzzled as to why it says it's better than Goonies 2. I don't think so. I think Goonies 2 is the better game by far. Just my opinion. Here's another great advertisement for the FCI phone counseling hotline, which sounds like a drug addiction hotline, and it's even made worse by the fact that the FCI logo looks like the eye of someone that's high on drugs. Just classic stuff. And then on the opposite page, this is interesting, Bishu joysticks. I don't remember these at all, but apparently this was a pretty popular line of joysticks in the late 80s. They kind of faded out in the mid-90s, but this is not the last we'll see of these joysticks in this particular magazine. There's 2 separate advertisements for some of their peripherals a little bit later on, so we'll be on the lookout for those. Here's mention of the Nintendo Game Boy in this particular issue of EGM. The power of the arcades in the palm of your hands. Well, not quite the power of the arcade, but what a game changer the Game Boy turned out to be. It is interesting that the article says that Nintendo is rumored to be releasing a portable LCD system. And I believe at this point the Game Boy had already been released in Japan. I think it was April of '89. And again, this issue is May of '89. So that does highlight one of the caveats of getting your game information from magazines back in the day. Oftentimes it was several months old by the time that it hit the shelves, but hey, we didn't care. That's the only way we could get it, so we took it. This was also a throwback for me, bringing the arcades home. I remember this, the Pro Play arcade cabinet from Eclectic Products. Basically, this was a full-size cabinet that would house a TV and also a console. You can see there in the little window the Nintendo console. I always thought these were cool because I loved going to the arcade. I loved arcade cabinets, and I thought it would be awesome to have one at home. Of course, now there's so many different arcade cabinets that you can get for specific games, or maybe a do-it-yourself build with all kinds of emulated games. But this was a real novelty back in the day, and I don't think too many were sold because I have not seen any of these in real life. However, I did see one up on eBay recently, even signed by Billy Mitchell and Walter Day. $2,000, a little bit out of my price range though. Here's a fact I found interesting while reading over this article for the arcade game Hard Drivin'. It described to me what sounded very much like the ghost car mechanic that so many racing games use today, and I got to thinking, what was the first game that ever implemented that mechanic? And after doing some internet sleuthing, it seems I can confirm that Hard Drivin' was in fact the first game to use this mechanic. It's been used in so many other racing games, but apparently Hard Drivin' was the first, which I didn't know that. Now this is an enjoyable little feature, Dare to Compare, where we stack up Tecmo Bowl against John Elway's quarterback. And I'll tell you, I was a little bit worried about this because of the John Elway's quarterback advertisement earlier in the magazine. I thought maybe there would be a conflict of interest here, but my concerns were unfounded. Obviously Tecmo Bowl, the better game, the more memorable game. John Elway's quarterback, pretty forgettable. And the reviewer here, he doesn't hold back. Tecmo Bowl pretty much trounces John Elway's quarterback in all these categories, except for two-player mode. And come on, I mean, this has to be just a little bit of a mercy grade here, throwing Elway a little bit of a bone. Are you really going to tell me that if you walk into a video store in 1989 with your friend and you're looking for a football game that you can play together, that you're going to pick John Elway's quarterback over Tecmo Bowl? I don't think so. But overall, this article's spot on. Tecmo Bowl wins hands down. Now here's a name you might recognize, Ken Lobb, who is known for working at both Nintendo and Microsoft, and probably most famously for having arguably the worst weapon in GoldenEye named after him as a way to pay homage to his contributions. But before any of that happened, he was apparently the product manager at Taxon, who made some pretty good games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But what I really love about this feature is this over-the-top humble brag. Apparently, Ken has close to every video game ever made, and he's beaten every game he's ever wanted to beat on the Nintendo Entertainment System. But that's just boring talk. I don't want to give Ken too hard of a time though, because he really has contributed a lot to the gaming industry over the years. Here's what I most look forward to each and every month, and that was the game reviews. Now, in the early issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly, their review system was a little bit different. They basically would assign a game to 4 different categories. If it was a great game, it would be a direct hit. If it was a good game, it would be a hit. If it was just an okay game, it would be a near hit. And if it was considered a bad game, it would be a miss. So our first review is for 1943. I've never been a big shmup fan, so I can't really comment as to how accurate this review was. I know modern takes on 1943, most people seem to like it, so it seems like a direct hit is probably pretty accurate for this game. And here's Racket Attack. We mentioned this game earlier in our top 10 list. I don't know what it is. Maybe there just wasn't many tennis games available at this time, but EGM thought it was pretty good. Personally, the first tennis game that I really enjoyed was Super Tennis for the Super Nintendo, so maybe it was the case that at this point there just wasn't very many good tennis games available. Next is Ultima, and this game scored a hit as well. I never got into the Ultima series, so I don't know if this game still holds up. But the next game I know does, Bubble Bobble, and this was rated as a direct hit, and this is still a very fun game to play even today, especially with 2 players. So in my opinion, this is a pretty accurate review. Next we have Bump and Jump for the NES, and this game also scored a hit, so EGM thought it was good. I remember this being a weekend rental when I was in grade school, and I don't remember it being a bad game. I don't remember it being a great game, so I feel like this is probably a fair review. Now for this next game, was I the only one that pronounced it wise until the advent of the internet? So Ys for the Sega Master System, and this I know is a popular series, but I have never played a single game in the Ys series, and it's my intention to do so. I just haven't done it yet. But here they seem to like this game. They scored it a hit. Now another Sega Master System game, Rastin from Taito, and like I said before, I never owned a Sega Master System, so I haven't played a lot of the games available for it. I know I loved the arcade version of Rastin. I thought it was just so cool. Be a barbarian, flaming sword, so awesome. If the Master System version came anywhere close to that, then I could see it being rated as a hit. This was an interesting one. Time Soldiers for the Sega Master System, and they didn't like this game. Gave it a near hit, or basically just an okay rating. And some of the modern takes that I've read on this game and watched on YouTube seems to be a pretty beloved game for the Sega Master System, so this review is a little surprising. Next is Hat Trick for the Atari 7800, and apparently this game was good. They gave it a hit. And then we come to our game of the month, which is Tengen Tetris. And if you're unfamiliar with the history of this game, and Tengen in general, it's quite interesting. The gaming historian has an excellent video on the subject over on his channel. And it's really not surprising that Tengen Tetris took Game of the Month, because it was an excellent version of Tetris right at the beginning of the Tetris craze when it was about to take off. And even though Nintendo did not approve of Tengen Tetris, you'll be happy to know that the US National Video Game Team awarded it its coveted seal of approval. Now here's the first of 2 advertisements for Bishu that I said would be coming up, and it's pretty evident they made a lot of peripherals. And I don't know if they were any good, but man, these colors were pretty awesome. Here we see in the early days of EGM, they actually reviewed computer games as well. F-19 Stealth Fighter, they really like this one. They gave it a direct hit. I can't really comment on early computer games either. I didn't get into PC gaming till the mid to late 90s. Here's a review for Zach McCracken, also for PC. And this is another game that's on my to-play list. Up to this point, I just haven't gotten to it, but I really enjoy LucasArts, especially their early point-and-click adventure games. They're so good. I do know there's some mixed feelings on this one. Some people think it's really good. Some people not so great, but EGM seemed to like it. They gave it a hit. We also have some reviews for Amiga games in this issue, and boy, I know there's a lot of love for the Amiga, and it's another system that I want to look into if I just had more time, because I know there's a lot of really good games that were released for it. And Hybris here was given a direct hit, and apparently this review is pretty spot on, because in checking contemporary reviews, it's still a very well-respected game. We also have Double Dragon for the Commodore 64. I was under the impression that most versions of Double Dragon, other than the arcade, the NES version, and the Game Boy Advance version, is really good as well. It's a hidden gem in my opinion, but all the other versions, from what I understand, were not very well received. But the reviewer here seems to have liked the Commodore 64 version. And as I'm looking at this, my goodness, what is wrong with Jimmy Lee's arm? It's huge. It looks like he's got a tumor growing where his tricep should be. I've never noticed that before. Fascinating. And then there's Sword of Sodan for the Amiga. For the longest time, I was only familiar with the Genesis version of this game, which has an absolutely awful reputation. And I have to admit, I lived in the Nintendo and Sega bubble for a long time, and so I didn't realize that the definitive versions of many games available for those consoles oftentimes appeared on previous systems, and this is one of those examples. This was a very well received game and still very much beloved today. Last, we have Offshore Warrior for the Amiga. This game didn't make much of an impression, and it appears that it's still perceived that way even today. It was given a near hit, and that seems like a pretty spot-on review. One of the things that you also run into frequently when reading these old magazines is just how many games and pieces of hardware were hyped up only for them to be canceled and then slip into obscurity. One of those pieces of hardware mentioned in this issue was the Konix Slipstream, or what became the Konix multi-system. This was a very ambitious project that aimed to incorporate many of the features found in deluxe arcade cabinets, such as racing wheels, flight yokes, pedals, and even a force feedback chair, into a home console. There was a lot of hype surrounding the system for just a brief moment, but by 1990, Konix had run out of cash and the system never made it to market. The last neat little tidbit we get in this issue is an early look at a prototype of the Super Famicom. It's pretty ugly. It looks like one of those Chinese Famiclones, but it is still closer to the final version that Japan and Europe got, which I feel is much prettier than the North American model. And on the back cover, we have another advertisement for Bishu. And just look at all of these controllers. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between some of them. The Zinger, the Hot Stuff, the Viper, they all kind of look the same to me, just with different color options. I don't know. I guess the Zoomer was the most popular. I'm not sure what game you'd use it for. Initially, Spy Hunter came to my mind because the arcade cabinet had a similar steering wheel setup. But I do like the fact that for their joysticks, they do have options for both left-handed and right-handed players. But unfortunately, even that wasn't good enough because this company, as I mentioned, didn't hang around for very long. So there is the highlights of Electronic Gaming Monthly issue number 1. It's really enjoyable to look at some of these old gaming magazines, and you should check some of them out yourself if you get the opportunity to do so. I could spend hours doing this, and it's kind of hard for me to justify spending that time, so given the fact that I'm able to share it with you, it makes me feel a little bit better. So if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see further magazine reviews in the future, please leave a like, leave a comment, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, happy gaming, my friends.